review of Last Night in Soho. Directed and co-written by Edgar Wright of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and Shaun of the Dead fame, Last Night in Soho is a psychological horror film that takes inspiration from fashion, films, and music from the 1960s. Wright's way of warning about the dangers of romanticizing the past, the film has been described as a, quote, dark Valentine to London and the Soho neighborhood. Starring Thomasin, McKenzie, and Anya Taylor-Joy in the lead roles, the two relative newcomers give standout performances in a cast filled with veterans in the industry. While the film has the usual Edgar Wright-isms we've come to expect, like match cuts and a killer soundtrack, you'll notice that it's more Hitchcockian in tone and story, something you can hardly pass off as coincidence considering the role those films had on the horror genre. Although I was a fan of the film, there's no denying that it had its flaws, including a few notable missteps that resulted in more questions being asked than answered. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at 2021's Last Night in Soho and diving into the things that made it good or bad. Obviously, this is my opinion, so there will of course be some things that I may have liked that you hated, or vice versa. It is what it is. And just as a disclaimer, I will be spoiling the film in this review, including the twist.
Let's get into it.
The film begins by introducing us to Ellie, a college-bound aspiring fashion designer with a love of all things 60s. Ellie lives in Cornwall with her grandmother, who has taken care of the young girl since her mother committed suicide years earlier, whose ghost Ellie occasionally sees. As Ellie gets ready to depart for the city, her grandmother expresses worry about her leaving, warning her that London is a dangerous place and that people aren't to be trusted.
London can be a lot. It was too much for your mum, perhaps. I worry you'll get all overwhelmed again.
When she arrives at school, Ellie finds herself the odd man out, struggling to befriend her passive-aggressive roommate Jocasta, having little in common with the rest of her party-going classmates, and having difficulties in her classes. Fed up with the situation, she moves into a place off-campus, owned by the elderly Miss Collins. The first night staying in the apartment, Ellie finds herself transported back to 1965 in a dreamlike state where she witnesses events through the eyes of a beautiful young woman named Sandie. Sandie, who Ellie is immediately charmed by, has grand dreams of becoming a star and begins a relationship with Jack, a manager of other young singers about town, who promises to make her a success. Upon waking up, Ellie discovers a hickey on her neck, much like the one Sandie received the night before, revealing that the two women are connected outside of the dream world. Enthralled by Sandie, Ellie begins designing clothing inspired by her and even starts talking and dressing similarly. Needing a job in order to keep up with her growing expenses, Ellie begins working at a local pub, where she meets a suspicious man who notes her resemblance to Sandie. As Ellie continues to visit the past, she discovers that Sandie's life isn't panning out the way she'd hoped, with the girl first working as a backup dancer in a burlesque show, before eventually being forcibly pimped out by Jack. As Sandie's circumstances continue to worsen, Ellie begins to see apparitions of the men who abused her, negatively affecting her state of mind out in the real world. One night she sees a vision where Sandie is murdered by Jack, which Ellie reports to the police, who treat her as though she's crazy. Believing that Sandie's murderer is the man she'd met at the pub previously, she accuses him of Sandie's death, only to discover that he was actually an ex-police officer who had once tried to help Sandie. Growing increasingly paranoid and distraught, Ellie decides to leave London, but not before informing Miss Collins of the situation, resulting in the landlady revealing that she's Sandie. It turns out that she hadn't been murdered by Jack, but instead had killed him and her other Johns, hiding their bodies in the floorboards of the apartment. The women engage in a fight which leads them back to the apartment, where they both see the ghosts of the men that Sandie had murdered. Ellie, who has witnessed everything Sandie has been through, tells her that she understands, leading Sandie to finally accept her fate. Telling Ellie to save herself, Miss Collins stays in the building as it burns down. Sometime later, Ellie takes part in a fashion show, combining elements of the present with the past, revealing that she's finally moved on. At least, somewhat. Let's just get it out of the way. Edgar Wright is an excellent filmmaker with an amazing attention to detail. Within the first 5 minutes of the film, you can understand everything you need to know about Ellie based off of her bedroom alone. The sequence where Sandie/Ellie are dancing with Jack is beautifully choreographed while still having a purpose, symbolizing how Ellie is being hypnotized by the glitz and glamour of the time period. Female revenge stories are a genre unto themselves, with graphic, exploitative works like Last House on the Left or I Spit on Your Grave long being the standard. In these films, the women are treated barbarically while simultaneously being hypersexualized, and their abuse eventually becomes what defines them, erasing them of the person they once were or could be in the future. By using this extreme violence for shock value, the subtleties of sexual assault the toilet has emotionally, mentally, and physically are lost on the audience. In this regard, Last Night in Soho is a welcome change to the format. While Sandie is shown in many upsetting situations, it isn't shot in an exploitative manner. She's still allowed to exist outside of her abuse. By showing how Sandie evolves from a strong and confident young woman to someone who's broken and been betrayed, her motivations are more nuanced, allowing the audience to decide for themselves if she's doing the right thing by murdering the men who've abused her. Edgar Wright has admitted to being heavily inspired by 1973's Don't Look Now and 1965's Repulsion, with the latter's influence being immediately apparent in both the plot of Last Night in Soho and its themes. The main character in Repulsion, Carol, is a frightened, isolated young woman who is repulsed by sex and distrustful of men. Left alone, she begins to experience frightening hallucinations that cause her to act erratically, and after committing several murders, Carol is left in a catatonic state. Unlike Sandie, Carol's sexual abuse is only implied, but it signifies the power that unresolved trauma can have on one's psyche, something we see in Last Night in Soho with Ellie being literally haunted by Sandie and her abusers. The success of the film hinges on the one-sided relationship between Ellie and Sandie, and it plays out brilliantly in the film. Sandie isn't just the person that Ellie wishes she could be, but she's everything Ellie wished her mother could have been as well. Charming, confident, beautiful. Because Ellie is so attached to Sandie, her eventual fall from grace is all the more personal, and its effect on Ellie's own mental health and emotions is more understandable. All of this couldn't have been achieved without Thomasin McKenzie, who turns Ellie from your ordinary outcast into someone with depth and desires. Some reviewers have said that Jocasta is a one-note caricature of the stereotypical mean girl, but as someone who has met many people working in fashion, I actually found her remarkably accurate. There will always be that one wealthy white girl who acts better than everyone else and wants nothing more than to see you fail. Plus, the fact that she and her friends dressed up as the girls from 1996's The Craft brought a smile to my face. This is perhaps me being nitpicky, but I absolutely despise Ellie's fashion show at the end of the film. It's meant to be this big moment that shows the character's evolution and how she's come to terms with her past and is looking towards the future and has become more confident, but the designs themselves are just ugly. There honestly isn't that much of a change from the original 60s inspired looks, except for the fact that the straps now look like belt buckles. Now, she's just a student, so she's obviously not going to be releasing fully formed collections yet, but considering the costume designer did such a fabulous job with the rest of the film, this left me wanting more. I also have to say that I think Edgar Wright is a bit heavy-handed with the ghostly apparitions at times, making the movie more silly than spooky, with this tonal shift marking the dislike many people had for the film's third act. There are also certain moments that utilize CGI that just don't look as good as they would have if they were a practical effect. Considering Edgar Wright once made Michael Cera throw a box in the trash over 30 times to get the right shot, this felt kind of lazy in comparison. Disregarding those tiny issues, my biggest problem with the film revolved around one of its major plot points, Ellie's visions. Early on in the film, we're shown that Ellie is able to see her mother's ghost, but considering that plays no part in the story aside from giving her grandmother a reason to worry about her, I would have preferred if that wasn't included at all. If they were going to have Ellie follow in her footsteps, down to becoming a fashion designer and having mental illness, then they should have gone a step further and given the mother's suicide more reasoning than just, she was overwhelmed. Considering how nervous Ellie is around men, often misreading their behavior, combined with her grandmother's worries about London, I think if her mother had been in the city and gotten assaulted before committing suicide, it would have given all of their characters stronger motivations. This would also make Sandie's storyline all the more heartbreaking for Ellie to watch, as it would be like seeing what her mother went through firsthand. Because Ellie isn't seeing random, unrelated ghosts as she's walking around town, clearly she doesn't have your usual psychic abilities, so it would have made more sense if her visions only began once she'd entered Sandie's apartment. Considering the amount of hardship Sandie faced in that room, as well as all the dead bodies inside of it, it's no stretch of the imagination that it could be haunted. If Ellie didn't have the ability to see ghosts prior to coming in contact with the room, it makes the story more rooted in reality as opposed to the supernatural, which would help with some of the dialogue when she talks to both her grandmother and the police officers, who simply treat her as though she's gone crazy. If she's always seen ghosts, everyone else is treated as the villain, when the idea that she doesn't even know if she can trust herself is far more interesting and terrifying. Plus, with the room being haunted, it would explain why Miss Collins is eventually able to see the ghosts as well. If all of the people who stayed in the room were also given glimpses of the past like Ellie did, it would also explain why so many of Miss Collins' previous tenants had gone missing. They might have been scared off, or she could have killed them herself. Instead, we're expected to think of her as nothing more than a crazy landlady in a cheap attempt to make the audience not look at her as a suspect. At one point, Ellie's visions are also used to create a gotcha moment, which I found insulting as a viewer. Because the visions have proven to be correct the rest of the time, it feels like a cheap cop-out to have them suddenly be wrong. You could have just as easily had the vision end abruptly, implying that Sandie might have been stabbed, and let Ellie's imagination and distrust of men do the rest. Another problem I have is with how certain characters act in order for the plot to progress. Why is Lindsay so evasive when it comes to answering Ellie's questions? No clue, but who else is going to be our red herring? Why is John so enamored with Ellie right from the start? Who knows, but we need him to prove that there are some decent men out there. These plot points could obviously still occur, but I think it could have been done in a far more natural manner instead of coming off as nonsensical. Now I'm sure you're wondering, are you sure you liked this movie? Considering all of the criticisms I had, but the fact that I'm able to pinpoint my issues so specifically is actually a testament to how good the film is. Bad movies are so bad that you don't even know where to start fixing them. What were your thoughts on Last Night in Soho? I hope you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!